Hello, and welcome to Rabble Radio. It's Friday, December 12th, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. This week on Rabble Radio, Rabble publisher Sarah Sahagian and Rabble editor Nick Seebruch discuss the major news in Canadian politics that happened this year, including the resignation of Justin Trudeau to now Prime Minister Mark Carney and his first months as leader, his budget and pipeline plans, the NDP leadership race, and more. Here are Nick and Sarah in conversation. Take a listen.
Hi, Sarah. We're back again, this time talking about a whole year's worth of news.
Hi, Nick. As always, it is a pleasure to be here. And yes, we're going to get to reflect on 2025, one of the most eventful years in recent memory.
Yeah, definitely a year where a lot of things happened. I don't know how much we'll be able to get to in about 20 to 25 minutes because there's so much to cover. It was definitely a historic year in Canadian politics. So let's start at the beginning. And a year in politics, I find, doesn't always start on January 1st. It often doesn't. I would argue that this year in politics started on November 5th, 2024. That was the day Donald Trump won the 2024 presidential election. And from that day, so many other things flowed out of that like a row of dominoes falling over one after the other. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's when the trade war really started, threats on our sovereignty. Soon thereafter, we get Chrystia Freeland's resignation. We get Justin Trudeau no longer as our prime minister, or announcing that he will soon no longer be the prime minister. A Liberal leadership race. Mark Carney randomly decides he wants to be prime minister. Wow, what a year. What a year. And you're right. It all started on Guy Fawkes Day, also America's federal election day in 2024.
Yeah. And, at that time, no one was really thinking about tariffs. No one really could conceive of Mark Carney as being the next prime minister. The Conservatives were looking to bury the Liberals, at least in the polls at that time. So let's start off with the immediate repercussions of that election. And I think probably the biggest one definitely didn't help Justin Trudeau, but I think might have been partially the nail in the coffin, was just it really increased his vulnerability. I think those people who felt that he was not the right fit for the job anymore really dug their heels in. And there were members of his own party who felt that way. Most notably of all, his finance minister and deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, who kind of forced his hand with his budget that he tried to put forward. She wanted nothing to do with it, and that led to basically a loss of confidence within the Liberal Party. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts were when on January 6th, Trudeau announced that he would no longer be running for re-election, to be resigning as prime minister.
You know, it was quite interesting because I think at the time, everyone assumed that Chrystia Freeland would be the Liberal Party heir apparent, but also I did not think she could get elected. I thought she was too associated with him. I didn't think she had enough of her own unique supporters. And I mean, I was right. Even within the party, as soon as Mark Carney turned up, the majority of people were willing to ditch her. What's interesting about Justin Trudeau in his final months as prime minister was I actually thought he gave a number of great speeches when the trade war started. I think he is, if nothing else, one of the better public speakers we've had in that office. And Justin Trudeau, this man is Teflon. His year is ending great. I mean, he gets to be on Katy Perry's yacht. He gets to be Instagram official with that pop star. He's having dinner with the former prime minister of Japan and his girlfriend, the pop star. I just have to say, as much as that is a superficial news story, it just shows you 2025 was such a weird year. It starts with Justin resigning. It ends with him in Japan with Katy Perry. Who saw this coming? The people who write Canada's story, right? If it were a TV show and that were written this way, people would say, it's jumped the shark. This is not realistic.
Yeah. And of course, part of something that characterized the whole conversation wasn't just, Donald Trump and his right wing rhetoric, the instability he brings to the US, but the direct and explicit threats he made to Canada's sovereignty. I think so much has happened this year. We kind of forget, oh, yeah, that 51st state stuff was in 2025. It was this year, this one year that feels like it was 5 years. And I think that really focused a lot of minds in the Liberal Party and across Canada, looking for someone to lead the country who they had confidence in to respond to Donald Trump, and not just to the tariffs, but to the threats against Canadian sovereignty. Trudeau, they felt wasn't the person, I think, because he kind of gets hung with that sort of drama teacher background, seen as, very amiable and maybe not as quite as hard nosed. But what do you think, Sarah?
I mean, it has been a very interesting year from the perspective of Canadian sovereignty. I don't think that was an issue that had been on people's radar very recently. I mean, I know that Stephen Harper was very focused on Arctic sovereignty. We had that whole sort of conflict with Greenland that was resolved actually through diplomacy. So I think sovereignty is something that Canadians had had the luxury of not pondering very often for many, many years. I mean, obviously, we had the War of 1812, and we had some issues in the 1800s, but that was sort of I think we thought was an old-fashioned concern. And I think what we're learning now is that when you are next to a superpower and the superpower's democracy isn't doing particularly well, then your sovereignty could be up for grabs. And another thing I just want to remind people of is that Trump has not completely stopped talking about this. It's just less newsworthy because it's not as shocking anymore. We're used to it, right? It's become normalized. He still makes the odd comment like this. He hasn't really shown that much respect for Mark Carney. It's clear he thinks he's smarter than Trudeau, and he doesn't call him governor of Canada or 51st state. But other than that, the man hasn't really negotiated very well with Carney, which actually, I mean, we can, and I'm sure we will talk about this, Carney pitched himself really as the savior of our economy. And at the moment, he's not doing a great job of negotiating with Trump. I don't want to be too critical because I'm not saying I would do an amazing job, but I also didn't pitch myself to a country with no political experience saying I'm the person to lead you through this crisis.
Yeah, and I think you really laid out why the Liberals chose to go with him as leader during their leadership race. They chose him as leader on March 9th of this year. And then very quickly after that, he had his first cabinet. Very shortly, within a few weeks after that, he called an election for the middle of April. And that election really kind of was the story of the economy, who had the best vision for the economy. Trump was definitely a factor in that, and tariffs and the threats to the sovereignty. And I think, unfortunately, it was the NDP who were the biggest losers out of that election, who really saw their support evaporate in favor of not just the Liberals, but some working class voters. A large proportion of working class voters turned to the Conservatives as well. So you were very much involved in our election coverage as well. You monitor that race. I was just wondering, as an observer, what did you think?
No, I mean, it was definitely an interesting election because it just turned on a dime. It looked like it was a certain victory for Poilievre and his Conservatives, as you said. And then the Liberals, in my opinion, became more conservative and kind of competed with Poilievre almost like they were the progressive Conservatives of the 1980s as opposed to the Liberals of this era. It was interesting. I, as somebody who's not right wing, was pretty upset to see a centrist party go further to the right. I mean, I don't agree with everything Justin Trudeau did, but he had a lot of policies that actually had previously been NDP policies that I think when he implemented, made the country better, such as universal childcare, making dental care more accessible. All of these things have had tangible benefits. So it was an interesting election. And it was very clear that Canadians, in my opinion, were voting on an existential level, right? We were voting to protect our sovereignty. And I do think that was the question. It came down to, who do you think can protect our sovereignty in this country? People, I think, voted literally based on vibes. I'm not even joking. I think it was, who do you think has the best vibe to go negotiate with Donald Trump? Because Mark Carney has had big jobs, because he's been the governor of the Bank of Canada and he has had that top job in the United Kingdom too. I think people just thought he had gravitas. And that sounds like such a superficial thing, but I don't think it came down to policy at all. I think it came down to this existential threat and asking ourselves, who do we think just seems like the strongest of these strong men? And I do mean men because it was all men who were running for each major party.
As leaders of each party, yes. Well, except for Elizabeth May, but each of the largest parties. Carney secured his mandate, a slim, just shy of a majority. He's in a minority parliament, so we gotta grade him on that scale. But he's been in office in this term since April. He hasn't secured a trade deal with the US. In terms of milestones or achievements, he's passed his budget just a couple of weeks ago, his first budget, 5 months after being elected. And then most recently signed a memorandum of understanding to build a hypothetical nebulous pipeline that will perhaps one day exist that runs from Alberta to the BC coast and essentially would have to knock down a series of environmental regulations to get there. So just thoughts on the Liberal budget, which was very much skewed towards the military, a lot of pullback on the environment and other issues. So let's start with the budget. What did you think?
Well, it was an austerity budget. I mean, we were worried that things like wage would be completely cut, right? Because that funding for women and gender minorities is so important. It did get some funding, not as much as a lot of people were hoping. And austerity was just sort of the theme, unless you're the military. Right. And Carl Nuremberg, our parliamentary reporter, has discussed this with us. And it is definitely, it does remind you of Dwight Eisenhower's idea of the military industrial complex, which I've actually done a lot of deep dives on recently, because I do think we're kind of going back to this era. I mean, not necessarily, Canada can't compete in an arms race, so we wouldn't say we're in an arms race, but we are going back to this era where we are really centering the military. And even Dwight Eisenhower, general in charge of D-Day, didn't think that was a good way to run your society if you didn't have to run your society that way. So I don't know if people remember the history of the 20th century well enough to have learned our lessons. But a really great point that Eisenhower used to make is that for every tank you build, you could have built usually multiple hospitals. You could build schools. You could build miles and miles of road, right? All of this infrastructure. And so at a time when we're really concerned about the Canadian economy, and we're also concerned about issues like healthcare, spending on the military, something people need to realize if we're actually going to spend 5% of our country's money on the military, is taking money away from your kids' education, from your mom's healthcare, from building roads that can get you from place to place in this giant country, from public transportation. So anyway, those are just my musings. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, we know that the military is one of the largest environmental polluters, one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And I think when you talk about the change in the character of the Liberal Party, really the biggest change is its attitude towards the environment under Mark Carney, because it's investing huge amounts of money into this massive polluting machine, the military, as well, while it's pulling back on environmental greenhouse investments. And just last month, it signed a memorandum of understanding that we'd mentioned previously with the government of Alberta to build a new pipeline that would require going through Indigenous land. It would require getting to the BC coast. It would require lifting the tanker ban on the BC coast so that oil can be shipped from there out to other markets. That tanker ban's in place because of how hazardous the BC coast can be, how we've seen along the Pacific coast significant tanker spills in recent history in the 1980s. And part of that memorandum of understanding also saw changes to the industrial carbon price in Alberta. It saw more investments in carbon capture, which environmental advocates like David Suzuki say are a red herring. They're not ever really going to provide the offset that you need to address the climate crisis. So really what we're seeing is a Liberal Party that used to care quite a bit, or said it cared quite a bit about the environment, and just now drop a lot of that and move more into a focus on becoming a so-called energy superpower primarily through the extraction and export of fossil fuels.
Absolutely. I mean, what's happening with the climate is quite upsetting. We know that we're in a state of climate crisis. We know there's not a lot of time to do damage control. I mean, there definitely is damage many scientists believe is irreversible, but the opportunity we have to mitigate the harms, it's happening now, and we don't want to squander it. So it is interesting to see not a complete disregard from the environment from the Carney government, but it's definitely been deprioritized, I would have to say. And what you just gave us some very eloquent examples. Okay, so we've talked about Carney. If you had to give, I don't know, a one sentence review of him as prime minister in 2025, what would you say?
Everything that Brian Mulroney wishes he could be, or wishes he could have been. Yeah, he's really that, like you said, that progressive conservative prime minister from the 1980s, but on 2025 steroids. But just to wrap up the story of the federal election, of course, as we mentioned, the NDP saw a dip in their support. They went down to just 7 seats, losing official party status. The party is also in significant financial debt. And we are now in a leadership race for the NDP. Jagmeet Singh, right after the election, stepped down, and currently in the race, time of recording, are 5 candidates. We have Heather McPherson, we have Avi Lewis, we have Rob Ashton, we have Tennille Johnston, and we have Tony McQuail. There's been one candidates forum hosted by the Canadian Labour Congress. There was a supposedly French language debate, even though really only Avi Lewis's French was passable enough to work in that debate. And it's going to be a long race. It's a race that will go on until March 26th, the week of March 26th, at the NDP National Convention in Winnipeg. And just your thoughts on the state of the NDP and what you think they need to get back on their feet, at least from a leader.
I wish I knew what they needed. I keep thinking about this. This is my Roman Empire, because I'm not exactly sure what they need. Part of me thinks that the logical choice is just Heather McPherson, because she has shown she can get elected. And at this point, what they need is someone who can prioritize official party status. I think that's the first step. It would be really unlikely for them to go from 7 seats to forming government for the first time. Stranger things have happened in the world. It's possible. I think it's unlikely. I think for this next leader, you need someone who can rebuild and hopefully get them back to official opposition status. Then perhaps the next leader can look to build on that success. And I do think if they're going to win, they do need someone who can speak French. So either Heather McPherson needs to do Duolingo and actually put the time into learning French if she ever wants to be prime minister, or she needs to accept that at a certain point, if she became the leader of the opposition, she would have to step aside for a more electable candidate. And then sometimes I think that they just need a complete departure. And I don't know what that looks like. I think that Avi Lewis has a lot of good policies. I'm very concerned about the fact that he has never actually been able to win even an election as an MP and get into office. That does concern me about him as a campaigner, his electability. But as you said, he speaks French. He has some interesting ideas. He's pretty articulate. He's a smart guy. But I mean, we've had a lot of conversations in our office about Rob Ashton, and that would definitely be a different direction. As Carl Nuremberg pointed out at one of our staff meetings, the NDP has never had a federal leader who came from a working class career. So that would be a really interesting and exciting moment for them. What do you think?
Yeah, well, Rob Ashton, president of the International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union. So, very, I think an interesting candidate, and one who secured, I think, the first major endorsement of the race, that of the United Steelworkers, which he received earlier this month. I think that is a big sign of the confidence that the labor movement has in him. The United Steelworkers represent over 225,000 workers across the country. They're the union under the most pressure right now from the Donald Trump tariffs. So their endorsement of Ashton, I think, says a lot about where they would like to see the party go. And as we'd mentioned in the last election, some of their worker base had turned to the Conservatives, and maybe this is how they get that base back. Now, just in the last few minutes that we have, I do want to mention, of course, the ongoing genocide in Gaza. we wouldn't want to wrap up our discussion of this year without mentioning the ongoing conflict there, because it's something that we've covered very heavily on Rabble, and, rightly so. We've heard about it discussed many times on this podcast this year, and wondering what your thoughts were on how specifically maybe it should shape the NDP leadership race. Would you like to see more discussion of this during the race?
I definitely think it's an important thing. And our fellow Bridget Protowski also has a great article about how Canada is giving less foreign aid. And so international issues and Canada's stance on these issues, on foreign politics and human rights abroad, is something that I think it's in flux, where we stand as a country and what our perspective is going to be. So I think it should be central to the debate when you have huge issues like this in the world. So I would like to see lots of discussion about this. I would also like to see discussion about foreign aid in general as well, right? What, as a country, what do we want to do? How do we want to show up for our neighbors in other countries, right? How do we want to show up on the world stage? Our identity, I think, benefits from the goodwill of a past where we did invest a lot in foreign aid, right? There is this perception globally that Canadians are invested in peacekeeping and diplomacy, but that reputation isn't really earned at this point, and is something that, even though it's a source of pride for Canadians, I think that we can't really legitimately, credibly claim anymore. So I would like to see that be central to the debate, discussing these issues and where Canada should stand on them.
Absolutely. And, all these issues like Gaza, like the NDP leadership race, and of course, everything happening in federal politics and politics across the country is something that we're very dedicated to covering. And if you wanted to support our work here at Rabble, please visit rabble.ca/donate. Any amount really helps us bring the news that matters to you, independent media from a progressive perspective. Please consider visiting rabble.ca/donate today and supporting Rabble. Sarah, thanks again so much for joining me for another great conversation, and I'll see you next year.
Thanks for having me. Happy New Year, almost.
Happy New Year, everybody.
That was Rabble publisher Sarah Sahagian and Rabble editor Nick Seebruch in conversation. Thanks so much for that, Sarah and Nick. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. To do that, let's turn things back over to Rabble editor Nick Seebruch. Back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. Starting this week with national news. The NDP Leadership Committee, which certifies candidates for the NDP leadership race, has disqualified Yves Engler from running. The committee said it disqualified Engler for issues relating to his behavior. The Montreal-based writer and activist was accused of denying the Rwandan genocide, promoting anti-Semitic narratives, and echoing anti-democratic talking points from Russia. Furthermore, the party accused Engler of undermining the NDP with his criticism of the party and harassing public figures through his journalism work. Engler called the decision to block him from running for the NDP leadership undemocratic, and said that the NDP supporters should be allowed to decide if he is qualified to be leader or not. He said that he would continue his campaign to be leader right up until the NDP convention in March of 2026, and would be appealing the leadership committee's decision to the NDP Federal Council. Engler has raised the required $100,000 entry fee in donations he's received over the past few months, and said that money would be returned to anyone who asked for a refund. In labour news this week, Ontario education unions are calling on the province to invest more money in the wake of poor standardized test scores. The annual Education Quality and Accountability Office test scores were released last week, showing a drop in proficiency in math and literacy amongst school-aged children. Unions like the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation say that failing test scores and rising violence in classrooms are directly related to the Ford government's underfunding of education. The union says that the amount of money that the province spends on education has not kept up with the rate of inflation, meaning that in terms of real dollars, the province is spending $6 billion less on education than it did 6 years ago. Staying in labour news, The Justice Drivers Coalition is an advocacy group dedicated to supporting drivers in the commercial trucking industry. They say that too often, drivers are left with little support if their employer fails to pay them. Under the law, many commercial truck drivers are classified as independent contractors. Because of this, not only do they have less access to benefits, they also have fewer protections to guarantee that their outstanding wages are paid. One driver, Karen Veer, is still owed a combined $40,000 from two former employers. He petitioned the Industrial Labor Relations Board asking for a ruling compelling his former employers to pay him. Even though the board ruled in his favor, the employer is still refusing to pay him. Justice for Drivers wants the federal government to enact stronger regulations on the trucking industry to better protect drivers. Also this week, Rabble examines the case of a Canadian company providing armored vehicles to the U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, also known as ICE. The administration of U.S. President Donald Trump is paying Brampton, Ontario-based Rochelle LLC $7 million to provide their signature Senator armored vehicles. This comes at a time when Trump continues to make threats to Canadian sovereignty and undermines the Canadian economy with tariffs. As well, ICE has been detaining immigrants and visitors to the U.S., sometimes for months at a time without trial, and deporting them, and this includes Canadian citizens. Meanwhile, Ontario Premier Doug Ford applauded the deal, saying that it would create more jobs in Ontario. And finally, in environmental news, David Suzuki warns that the U.S.'s hostile actions against Venezuela could cause an environmental disaster. The U.S. has stationed a large fleet off the coast of the oil-rich nation of Venezuela for several months now. They have also been bombing ships in Venezuelan waters, often claiming, without evidence, that these ships have been involved in drug trafficking. Earlier this week, the U.S. seized a Venezuelan oil tanker while it was traveling on the high seas. Suzuki says that these reckless actions could easily lead to a scenario where an oil tanker is accidentally targeted and sunk, leading to a massive oil spill that would destroy the biodiverse ecosystem in the waters around Venezuela. And as always, you can read about all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Narenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brienne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.